was reading an article the other day, and it was talking about how the restrictions that have been in place due to the coronavirus throughout the world has led to increased tensions in marriages and family situations. The fact that we are in close quarters with each other much longer than normal has increased the amount of conflict present. And I can't help but think that a large part of that conflict has resulted from the use of our tongue, how we speak to each other. Paige and I were discussing this chapter in James the other day and noted how we probably use the harshest words that we use and language that we use with those closest to us. And as James says, brothers, this shouldn't be. It's not the way it should be. But conflict is inevitable. We can't escape conflict. From the fall all the way to Jesus telling us that in this world we are going to have troubles. So we can't avoid conflict. But how can we handle this conflict so that it doesn't consume us, so that we're not pouring gasoline onto the fire? Well, James, as he concludes his treatise on the tongue in chapter 3, makes this statement. He says that in verse 18, a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, I would hope that spurs a thought in you back to Jesus and the Beatitudes, in particular Matthew 5:9. There, Jesus says that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. So we're called to be peacemakers, and we can do that with our tongue if we have heavenly wisdom. That's the point of that last section in James, that we work with heavenly wisdom, not worldly wisdom, not man's wisdom, but heavenly wisdom. So I want us to talk briefly about what it means, what it looks like to be a peacemaker. First, I want to say what it's not. I had a seminary professor that phrased it this way a couple times. He says that one, it's not being a peace faker. Many of us, when we face conflict, we like to run away from it, or we ignore it, or we make excuses for ourselves, or we try to place the blame on others, and we try to pretend that there is no conflict. We'd rather pretend than face the issues. So it's not being a peace faker. It's also not being a peace breaker. Some of us, when we face conflict, go straight into attack mode. I can't help but think a lot of us scroll through our Facebook feeds looking for places where we can comment, where we can point out where people are wrong and how they need to change their thinking, and that this is wrong and they need to address these issues. So it's not being a peace faker. It's not being a peace breaker. I also think it's also not being a peacekeeper. Now, that's a common word we use. That's used for the UN people, that they're peacekeepers, but they hardly ever actually seem to resolve issues. Many of us are more interested in peace than right in keeping things according to what we've learned and what we know to be true. A Puritan teacher once said that man's way of peace is to sacrifice purity for harmony. That we're willing to sacrifice some core things that are core to the gospel often, in order to try to keep the peace. But notice how that contrasts with the command of Scripture, what Jesus says is blessed, and what James has mentioned here. He says that we are to be peacemakers. And there's two things we need to understand in that definition. One is is the word peace. What does it mean to have peace? We often think that means the absence of conflict, but I think it's deeper than that. Jesus, we know, is called the Prince of Peace. Well, how did he bring peace? Well, he brought peace by reconciling us to God. He took and restored this relationship that was broken and made it right. We went from being the enemies of God to being his friends, more than that, to being his sons and daughters. So peace is restoring relationship. Secondly, you're to be a peacemaker, meaning that's an active role. We're supposed to actively seek peace, actively make peace with people that we're in conflict with. Paul tells us this in Romans when he says, if it's up to us, if it's at all possible according to what we bring to the situation, we should live in peace with each other. So how do we do that? What's the practical side? Well, one, I think it starts with what Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, that we need to examine ourselves. We need to remove the log from our own eye so that we can help address the splinter that's in our neighbor's eye. So we need to examine our own self and see what role we've played in the conflict, and did we cause this? if we've done that, secondly, if there's still an issue there, I think our next call is to actually overlook the offense if that's possible. We're not seeking to sacrifice and compromise truth, but if we can overlook the offense, we should do that. Many Proverbs tells us that the wise man ignores the insult. Paul tells us in Colossians that we should bear with one another, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven us. In 1 Peter, we're told that love covers a multitude of sins. So is it something that I can overlook? If it's not, if it's something that still is a core issue that needs to be addressed, then I think we follow the biblical route of handling discipline with other people that we find in Matthew 18. One, we need to go talk about it. We need to have a conversation. Same thing we see in Galatians 6 with our brothers, that we're to talk about these issues and work towards resolution. In both situations, the point of this confrontation is to restore the relationship. It may not settle the issue, it may not establish who is right. The point is to restore the relationship, to have reconciliation. If at that point things haven't been resolved, then I think it's fair to bring in outside people. That may be a pastor, maybe an elder, it may be a mutual friend, but we can bring in an outsider at that point, but still with the goal to create peace, which means to restore the relationship, to bring about reconciliation. All these things are brought about by our words, how we speak to each other. We once again are called to be little Christ. We're called to be peacemakers with those around us.